Is it my imagination? Or do you hear that as well? Bugger. Hello fellow CNC nuts and welcome. Today's project has been cancelled. You heard the noises coming from the armature of my router, and that's not good. Here's an armature out of my spare router. It has a shoulder on it that the bottom bearing sits against. There's then a dummy nut held in place by a keyway, and finally a nut goes on to lock that all together. Now when it's in this position here, there is no up and down movement here, which I can definitely feel when I do that. There's an absolute minimal amount of side to side play when I twist it. And that's the clearance of this bearing, as these are designed to expand when they get hot. So when they're cold, there is a bit of clearance on it. And that clearance is also going to be taken up by the top bearing here. It's not going to twist when it's in position. And it sure as hell does not make a clicking noise like this one. So I need to pull it apart and find out what's wrong. Now this is a bit of a pain to get apart, because unlike most routers which are just held in place with a bolt, this one's got all cable ties coming into it. It's got this arrangement on top here to force air through it because its internal fan self-destructed, and it's also got the super PID built into it. So pulling it apart is a bit of a pain. I've been planning on replacing the brushes for a while now, so this is a great opportunity to do that. I keep an eye on this brush here because it's the only one I can get at. It looks like it's worn about halfway down, or a bit more than halfway down, so definitely time for it to be replaced. Unfortunately, the whole thing has to come out for me to get at the rear brush, so again, this is an ideal time to do that. Let's pull it apart and get on with it. Now before we start, a quick word about safety. When you're doing this, make sure you unplug the router, which I'm going to do right now. Turning it off at the wall is not good enough. You have to make sure it's unplugged. Even when it's turned off, these brushes here can still be alive. If you don't think it's working, just beware. These can still be alive, and they will bite you once you start poking metal screwdrivers into them. So you've been warned, make sure you turn it off. Okay, so the first thing I'm going to do is I'll remove the mascot, probably half the cause of my problem anyway. And I'm going to remove the super PID optical sensor, which just sits in here. There's a small plastic tube here that goes into the router, and there's the optical sensor, and that does the speed control, speed regulation of my router, keeps the router running at a constant speed. Next I need to lift this here off, but I'm going to have to remove at least one cable tie, so I'll just get rid of that and we'll see if this will now come off. I guess it does. There we go. So that's that there off there. Now of course this fan arrangement drives air through my router so that it can keep cool. You notice this plastic tube's still stuck in here. I don't want to remove that at all. Next I need to remove this here. I've already unbolted that. And another thing is there's another sensor just down here, this one here, that sits against the router body and sends the temperature down to my temperature sensor, which I have built into my controller. Okay, well this here should now just lift out of here with luck. And it does. Just push the gantry back a little bit. And hopefully I'll be able to work on this here without having to unclip anything else. Okay, first thing I'm going to do is I'm going to remove the brushes. Double check it's unplugged. So there's one of the brushes, and it's actually not quite as bad as I thought it was. But it is about halfway. Let's see what the other one's like. Yeah, this one's a bit more worn than the other one. So I'll just put these parts aside. And now I'm going to take the nuts off here. So this is the bottom nut that holds the collet in place. I've already removed the collet. Now I need to remove this nut here. I'll just take this here off. That's good. Now the dummy nut will come off. I'm just going to put it so that the keyway faces up. You can see the little keyway here just in the nut. And here's that little key I was talking about. So I'm just going to put that down here. I definitely don't want to lose those. Now I need to undo this 4 screws in the top of the router here. And in actual fact, I can't even get down to them. There's so much dust in them. I have to try and clean them out. Well, there we go. I'm in luck. It's come apart reasonably easily. There's me bearing down in there. There's quite a bit of dust built up in there. And here's that top bearing and the disc I was talking about. In actual fact, that disc needs repainting, which should actually help the Super PID work even better. And yeah, there's a bit of dust in there. Looking at the armature here, there's very little wear on here, which is excellent. This armature should last me for quite a few more years yet, that's for sure. Let's go look inside here. It's pretty clean in there. I might just give that a wee clean when I'm done. I'm guessing at some stage that this tube is pushed down just a little bit too far and rubbed on here, though barely. It may even be the sensor. Maybe the sensor has rubbed on it slightly. Fortunately, it hasn't rubbed enough to damage it. I'll make sure that it doesn't come in contact with that disc when I put it back together. I'll take these screws out. There are 3 screws that hold a cover plate in place. So there's the cover plate that holds the bearing into the thing, and it's, well, the bearing's definitely in good and tight. There's a hell of a lot of slop in that bearing though. It shouldn't be doing that. While it seems to run smoothly, it sure as hell has got a lot of slop in those bearings. So that's toast. Now that I've found it, what I'll do is put it back together again. So I removed the top bearing off here as well, and here it is here, and I can actually hear that when I rotate it. It's got quite a bit of movement backwards and forwards. The bearings sound quite dry, so I've replaced that while I've got it apart. I also had to take this piece off to do that, so that was a good opportunity to clean it right off and repaint it. So I've still now got my black and white, and they're well defined on here. It should make the Super PID run even better, although I haven't had any problems with it. I've got my new bearing here. I keep a couple of spares just in case, because you never know when you're going to need them, and to get these I will have to order them, so it's good to actually keep them on hand. Now I'm going to try and get this in place. It's not going in as easy as I'd hoped. There we go. It should slide in by hand. You should not need to force these. They may take a bit of pressure, but you should be able to get the bearings on and off, or certainly on by hand, and you may need to use a puller or something similar to get them off, but they should go on by hand. And so I can now tighten that collar in place. If you want to know how to disassemble or reassemble any of a router like my one, then have a look at my 3-part series on disassembling and rebuilding this router. Slides in there very nicely. I'm just going to push this here into place up here. Now the spindle should turn nice and freely. There's nothing rubbing on anything, so that's good. I can now put in the keyway. The dummy nut. The locking nut. Right, that's nice and tight. Still free running, nothing's binding on anything. I'll put the bottom collet nut on there for protection. I can now look at the brushes. I've got these replacement brushes here. Here's the originals and here's the replacement. You can see just over half of them are gone on this one. It's about the same on the other one as well. Okay, well that sounds alright when I'm rotating that as well. Should hold it nice and firmly in place. I can pull on that now. There's no no up and down slop, no backward forward slop going on here, so that's good. This here needs to carefully go back in place. That goes around there. This here goes around, the little tube goes up the centre. I can put my sensor back in place as well. This time, to make sure the sensor doesn't go too far in, I've added another little O-ring at the very top, which will hold it off by that amount to stop it going down any further. Got my little temperature sensor there that tucks in beside the router and keeps an eye on the router temperature. I need to replace the cable tie that I removed. And that's looking pretty good. So now the router's back together, it's always a good policy to do some electrical safety testing on it if you have the equipment. Mine is not a double insulated router, so the first thing I need to check is continuity between the earth pin of my plug and the body of the router. So I will test at various points. I'll go to the chassis of the router and I've got 0.15 of an ohm. I'll come up here to the on-off switch. Whoops. And again I have 0.17 of an ohm. And I'll come down here to the spindle, which is actually the armature, and I have 0.18 of an ohm. So that's great. All the metal parts here are grounded, and that's really important because if anything goes wrong inside the router here, I know that I'm protected from electrical shock. The other test I'm going to do is I'm going to do an insulation test. I'm going to bridge out the phase and neutral on here, connect my meter to the chassis of the router, and I'm just going to push the button on this here. What that does is it puts 500 volts through the phase neutral winding of the router, and we're just checking to see if it breaks down, and I'm getting 133 megohms. So that's 133 million ohms of resistance, which is well above the maximum required. So long as I'm above 5 megohms, I'm fine. So I'm well above it. I know that the router is good and ready to plug in. Let's do it. And there we go. I'll go and change the speed of the router and we'll see that it winds up and winds down as it should do. Well, as you heard there, the Super PID is doing its job, regulating the speed of the router from 5,000 RPM all the way up to 20,000. Well, it's certainly been an interesting day. When I started, I didn't expect to be changing the top and bottom bearings on my router. It just goes to show it's worth having those spare parts sitting ready to use on hand. They're inexpensive to keep, but invaluable if you need them. Well, I hope you found this interesting. I hope you don't need to change the bearings on yours. Don't forget to like and subscribe, and I'll catch you guys later. Cheers!